I was browsing YouTube the other day and saw that there was only one 100 days video for Vintage Story. Really? I had experience doing these types of videos and I played Vintage Story recently, so I thought, why not me? I wanted some of those YouTube stonks, but I wanted to do it in style, mainly hardcore style. While there's no official hardcore mode in Vintage Story, you can set your life count to 1, which, well, makes it hardcore. For this playthrough, I had a few goals in mind. Goal 1. Survive 100 days. Do I really need to explain this one? Just FYI, 100 days in Vintage Story is roughly equivalent to 250 days worth of Minecraft. Yikes. Goal 2. Make a full set of steel plate armor. In my other playthrough, the best armor I managed to muster was a bronze lamella. I was going to fix that by making the hardest armor in-game. Goal 3. Raid Resin On Archives. There is a new story dungeon in 1.18 and I never got around to doing it in my other playthrough. Finally, goal 4. What I built in my review video was a dirt and cobblestone abomination. We were going to look fly this time around. With that in mind, these are the mods that I used. They're all quality of life mods that don't change the game fundamentally, so don't at me, bro. I did not change the default length, so my months were 9 days long, which meant while starting on May 1st, my 100-day mark would be April 2nd. You following? If this interests you, stick around. For my world settings, I changed my life count to 1. Pretty self-explanatory, we are hardcore in this bitch. I changed tree growth speed to 1, don't really know why since I never grow any trees anyway, but that is what everyone always recommends. Default speed is apparently extremely slow. Next, I changed prospecting pick radius to 8. Both 6 and 8 work just fine for detecting large ore deposits, but not great for precision, so there is a trade-off. Lastly, I changed polar equator distance to 25k. In my previous video reviewing the game, I suggested booking it south for warmer weather right off the bat, and that is what I intended to do this time around. But with a default distance of 100k, it becomes an impossibly long run. For my world seed, I typed Oscillaworld and hit create. For my class selection, I once again went with a blackguard. Felt like the most sensible choice for the hardcore. The extra health does really come in clutch, extra mining speed is always nice, hitting harder in melee is obviously huge, and the downside of extra hunger is never really a problem past early game anyway. Upon spawning into my world, I immediately crafted a knife and found the nearest body of water to collect enough cattails for 4 baskets. I crafted myself a shovel and grabbed myself some medium fertility soil. I was already thinking of farming flax, but maybe I was getting a little ahead of myself. I grabbed some fire clay nearby, since it's one of the more important materials for early progression. I started walking south. I was planning to settle in a much warmer climate and had a long journey ahead of me. In my first rune, I found some extra cattails and a couple of flint shovels. Nothing amazing, but it's something. In my second rune, I found a little bit of brown coal. It was starting to get dark, but I was not about to stop my pilgrimage. To sustain my monotonous walk, I would gather any mushrooms and berries I could get my hands on. As darkness started to surround me, I needed to make a pit stop to make a few torches. So I crafted an axe, cut down a tree, proceeded to make a campfire, and finally produced a few torches. I realized it was time to sprint. The drifters were out and about, and pelted me with their sticks and stones, which would break my bones if I wasn't sprinting. Once I lost them, I switched to walking because my food rations would not sustain a full-out sprint just yet. Upon stumbling into a patch of horsetails, I collected some and crafted myself some sows with the extra cattails from the ruins. Occasionally, I would stop to check my latitude. Vintage Story has a command that lets you do just that. I was at 38.95 degrees. Pretty good, but not good enough. In my mind, I was willing to settle below 35 degrees. I knew that 35-degree climate would be a nice median between teeth-chattering northern winters and insatiable southern heat. Unfortunately, local rift activity was quite high, and I was constantly running into drifters who were using me as target practice. Nothing a few healing salves couldn't resolve. I saw my first patch of sunflower plants, which meant I was on the right track. My next rune provided me with a nice amount of flax twine. My flax situation was already shaping up to be in a much better place than in my review video. In a welcomed sight, the darkness of my first night was fading away. In even more welcome sight, my next rune dropped me a copper pickaxe. This was going to be a legendary run. Upon consulting my latitude, I realized I was already at 35 degrees, which meant that I could finally settle down. Shortly, I found a cool looking rune inside of a majestic forest, and figured it was as good of a spot as any to start my empire. First on the agenda was to create more storage. Luckily, there was a lake nearby with plenty of cattails. Second was crafting an axe and clearing a bunch of trees cluttering my new dwelling. Third was trying to even the floor by removing all the random blocks. Shortly, I had way more space to work with. During the floor excavation, I stumbled upon a hidden water block. This kind of looked like a bug to me. Not sure where the water came from, but it was a nice find. I would not have a bucket for a little while, and this allowed me to have an easy access to water right inside my base. Next, I closed off the entrance while leaving a 2-block gap for a door and filled out the perimeter walls to make sure no drifters could climb from the outside. I slapped the door on my entrance and continued to clear the base from dirt blocks. Going hungry prevented me from finishing this task, and since I had a decent amount of daylight left, I went to forage for some berries. I grabbed every single berry bush I could find, with plans to relocate them to my base. While foraging, I stumbled upon my first surface copper deposit. Since I already had a copper pickaxe, I went digging. I was way ahead of the curve on the copper. Unfortunately, I would still need a hammer to break down the ore chunks before I could officially ditch my stone tools. By the time I was done excavating every single copper bit, it was getting dark, so I returned to my base to plant all the berry bushes I found. To fix my lack of a hammer, I clay formed a mold during the nighttime and started the firing process. Next, I began replacing all the grass blocks in my base with packed dirt. My initial farming setup was going to be inside, and I did not want any rabbits spawning on the loose grass blocks. Plus, grass blocks have an annoying tendency to catch on fire as well. Meanwhile, I needed more storage, so I clay formed a big storage container and fired that up as well. Of course, I needed a cooking pot and a few bowls to start cooking as well. A crucible was also integral to my success, so that was next. In bad news, I encountered my first drifter inside my base. It appeared to me that he climbed over my wall, so I raised my wall an extra block just in case. Next day came, and I went outside to hunt for some more berries and grabbed every bush afterwards. I was looking for vegetable seeds, but more than anything, I wanted to find as much flax as early as possible. I found my first NPC who happened to be a furniture trader, not exactly the most useful one to have around. Upon returning to my base, I had a lot of berry bushes to plant. Next, I tilled some medium fertility soil and started a flax farm. I went ahead and planted a few loose turnips as well. This meant I needed a watering can to irrigate my new field, so I clay formed and fired one right up. My storage vessel got done cooking, and it was a welcome addition. I needed all the storage space I could muster. Next on the agenda was panning bony soil. Luckily, I found some while excavating my ruin. At this point, I didn't realize you couldn't get copper nuggets from bony soil, which is why I was panning to begin with. This activity had to be interrupted with a trek outside of my base in the middle of the night. I had no food at all and was starving to death. Desperate enough for food, I decided to engage a boar in melee combat. But the pig gave me a proper beatdown before disappearing into the night, leaving me empty-handed. It did lead me to a few berry bushes as a consolation prize. The rest of the night went pretty uneventful, and at dawn, I gathered a few stacks of sand to pan on the next night. I was constantly on a mission of expanding my flax operation while planting anything else I could find as well. While not helping me to get copper, panning bony soil provided me with a few candles, which I placed around my base in hopes of suppressing drifter spawns. Once again, I did not want to waste any daylight, so I went out hunting for food. Learning from my previous encounter with the boar, I decided to start putting them into a pit and using a spear to safely kill them from a distance. Unfortunately, a boar's friend decided to show up out of nowhere to avenge his friend. While it didn't go as smoothly as I wanted, I scored my first big load of meat. This meat would keep me satiated for a little while. This was very timely, as once again, I was taking damage from starvation. The day concluded with me planting even more berry bushes. At night, I proceeded to pan regular sand in hopes of scoring enough copper for a hammer. Shortly, I had enough to fill the mold. Luckily, I had some brown coal from one of the first ruins to heat up the crucible. Of course, now that my watering can was done firing, I could start watering my garden. I was still working on clearing my base from regular dirt blocks and replacing them with packed dirt. Shortly, my base was cleared of all the trees and extraneous blocks, and my floor consisted mostly of packed dirt. It was starting to look nice, but my perimeter wall still had plenty of trees to take care of. Next, I started working on an anvil mold, but quickly ran out of clay. Luckily, I had a big fire clay deposit right outside of my base. That allowed me to finish the mold and fire it in the pit kiln. Of course, I also formed and fired a prospecting picked mold as well. While barely getting into copper, I was already planning for iron. Thus, I fired a set of fire clay bricks for a bloomery, way before I was anywhere near finding my first deposit. Of course, all of this metal working would take charcoal, so I proceeded to make a charcoal pit and started working on filling it up as well. The rest of the night was spent panning bony soil with hopes of scoring more candles. My base was dimly lit, which led to semi-frequent drifter spawns. Slowly but surely, I was covering my base in candles. North of my base, I found a decent field of horsetails, which allowed me to make sows so I could keep topped off. This was hardcore after all, and keeping healthy was a prime directive. I was constantly clearing trees around my base and planting more berry bushes. The following night, I could finally break down the copper chunks that I found hours ago and smelt them into a prospecting pick. I was fully ready to bum rush the iron stage at this point. Of course, one copper pickaxe was not going to get me there, so I made a pickaxe mold. Furthermore, I fired a few and got molds as well, because I wanted to get copper nails and a saw as soon as possible. Next on the list was to start prospecting. I needed at least 800 units of bronze alloy and a large iron deposit for the next step, which meant a lot of prospecting. While prospecting, I stumbled upon a surface deposits of brown coal. This would save me using precious charcoal for early smelting, which is of course nice. At night, I was busy panning bony soil and gathering wood for my charcoal pit. Next day, more prospecting was in the cards. Soon, I had a mining game plan. I found a chunk with a very high sphalerite, which hopefully would get me zinc, and a chunk of high bismuthine and decent hematite. I was hoping to get both bismuth and iron from the second chunk. I did not expect it to be a fast process, so I poured myself another prospecting pick and an extra pickaxe. I was all set for a big underground adventure. I would need a healthy supply of food to power my underground exploration though, so I found a few pigs and struggled to put them into a pit. I decided to see if I could lure them in instead. Unfortunately, I underestimated the pig AI and came very close to dying. Definitely the closest call I had so far. But you know what they say.
It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward.
Eventually, I defeated the pigs and cooked myself a nice pig and vegetable stew to power my exploits. And just like that, it was time to submerge myself into underground exploration. First on the agenda was to find zinc and bismuth. I was going to skip straight into an iron age, thus I only needed minuscule amounts of both. Just enough to make a bronze anvil and a pickaxe. My prospecting pick showed a trace amount of zinc almost right away. My precious zinc was somewhere in this chunk. Unfortunately, while a prospecting radius of 8 is great for letting you know things are present, it is really bad for narrowing down the exact location. I dug a few straight tunnels, but the amount did not seem to increase. However, when I tried digging down, the amount rose a bit, so I knew it had to be deeper. Soon, I detected medium amounts of zinc, but my temporal stability was already low, so I took a break to restore it. I went back to my base to water some plants. Nice and serene, just what my mind needed. I also preemptively smelted myself another pickaxe. There was still a lot of digging left to do. It was time to hit the underground once again. Unfortunately, I was struggling to find the deposit, and before long, I was once again running out of stability. To expedite my search in the future, I made myself a dirt tunnel to the surface. Some people prefer stairs, some prefer water columns, some recommend ladders, but for this Minecraft vet, dirt felt natural. To restore my sanity, I went on a tree cutting rampage. The outside of my base needed the extra space, and the wood would eventually make it to a charcoal pit as well, killing two birds with one stone. Once my sanity was restored, I used my express dirt tunnel to get back to digging. While having a promising start, I could not find zinc for the life of me. My sanity ran out one more time, and I returned to my base empty-handed. While my in-game sanity could be restored, my real-life sanity was starting to give. I spent some time digging dirt, trying to renew my vertical transportation method, and I had to make more copper tools. I kept wasting my tool durability and had nothing to show for it. Besides restoring my stability, this time around, I also needed to restore my hunger bar. I tried using my pit trick on a ram, but he was clearly smarter than a pig. Eventually, I gave up and used another famous block trick, a block pillar and a spear. This is a cheap and dirty trick for those who have no honor or integrity. Unfortunately, there were limitations to this method. You still had to chase your kill, unlike the pit trap. Unexpectedly, the previous failed pit attempt did come in handy for my second kill. Once I renewed my tools, food, and sanity, I decided to try my luck in a different chunk. I went straight down this time. However, I was rudely interrupted by the drifter rain falling from the sky. This forced me to plug up the hole. Once again, I was failing to find zinc and bismuth, but I did find some more copper. You know, considering I was running out of copper for the copper tools, I was not going to complain too much. What I was going to complain about were all the drifters trying to impede my progress. And impede they did, because once again, I was returning to my base empty-handed. I also had very close call with a drifter falling on top of my head. Perhaps vertical tunnels weren't all that safe. At this point, I thought I was living inside of a Groundhog Day movie. I got some dirt, I made more tools, I went back to digging. I wanted to give my original chunk one more try. This time around, a miracle. I found zinc almost right away. Big problem though, I only found incredibly small amounts. But after doing some math, surprisingly, it was enough for my plan. Mission accomplished. On the other hand, bismuth and iron were still somewhere deep underground, and based on how long it took me to find zinc, I was dreading the search quite a bit. As I was exploring a new chunk, I found a big cave, but chickened out exploring it. I knew that a single saw blade locust could spell my doom. In typical fashion, my sanity meter was holding me back. So, I returned to base and continued to work on a charcoal pit. At dawn, I returned to digging. Once again, I found copper, which there was no shortage of. But wait, there it was. A ton of bismuth ore everywhere. Way more than I was going to need. So I grabbed just enough. It was time to go home though. My sanity was hella low. Not a particularly pleasant effect. My screen was warping all over the place, and my avatar was squealing pathetically to remind me that he didn't appreciate this experience either. In an anticipation to finding iron, I finally fired up the charcoal pit. Spoiler alert, this pit would be a bane of my existence. Next, the exciting moment of pouring a bismuth bronze anvil and a pickaxe was upon me. A very satisfying feeling, I do declare. I made 3 bloomeries with the fire bricks that I had. I was fully prepared to process my first batch of iron, thus, it was time for iron exploration. I grabbed some dirt for vertical tunneling, while clearing even more space around my base. It was important not to forget my bronze pickaxe either. I would need it to extract iron from the rock. The chunk that so generously provided me with bismuth also happened to have decent levels of iron. At this stage in the game, I would freely travel at night. You know what they say.
I got a lot of living to do before I die, and I ain't got time to waste.
Using my patented dirt block elevator, I got low underground very quickly. Soon, I had my first iron hit on the prospecting pick. There was indeed iron in this chunk. The amount of iron detected by the pick kept rapidly rising. This felt too good to be true. But true it was. Soon, I narrowed the direction, and before long, I stumbled upon a very large iron deposit. Unfortunately, the quality of iron was low, which could mean even with a large amount of it, total could amount to very little. However, you don't look gifted horse in the mouth, so I grabbed everything I could with the sanity I had left, before being forced to retreat to my base. It was a happy retreat though. When I was back, I quickly loaded up my bloomeries with the unprocessed iron, but found that my charcoal pit was still smoldering. It has been at least 2 days since I started the pit. I suppose I should have known something was off right there and then, but instead I poured a bronze hammer and decided to give it some time. While waiting, I went out exploring, trying to score some more resin. I did not find any, but I did find some cabbage seeds in the ruins. At night, I went back to my iron mine. Iron would be a staple until the end of the game, and there would be no lack of demand. By the time I returned home, my charcoal pit was still somehow smoldering. I decided to make a more thorough search for resin during the day. Luckily, there was no shortage of pines north of me, so it was just a matter of time until I found some. But what do you know, my charcoal pit was still smoldering. Well, plenty of other things to do, like pursuing my first batch of leather. It just so happened to be that limestone was everywhere in my area, so there would be no long journey to find limestone or borax. Of course, I would need a quern, which meant the annoying process of liberating whole granite blocks by digging out all 6 sides. I will let you guess if my charcoal pit was finally done. And the answer is
no.
Next, I crafted a couple of forges, which thankfully only took cobblestone. Then, I crafted a quern and decided to grind some limestone. At this point, my charcoal situation was getting ridiculous. As a consolation prize, the game provided me with surface borax, which meant an underground deposit laid underneath. Getting to steel just got significantly easier. While still waiting on my charcoal, I decided to preemptively set up some soil on the small lake by my base. This would be transformed into a self-irrigating farming plot once I had some fencing. Meanwhile, the farming plot at my base was not going great. My flax was growing up very slowly, and my carrots were showing signs of heat stress. I guess there was a downside to living in a warm climate. After foraging the entire day, I came back to my charcoal pit to see it, you guessed it, smoldering. While watering my plants, I noticed that something was eating my crops. This is what happens when you slip up and let grass blocks proliferate. It was time to get rid of them, including the ones on the wall. I got impatient and started sleeping through the night in hopes of forcing the pit to completion. But it absolutely refused. Well, still plenty things to do. So I went out to gather as many flax seeds as I could. On my flaxpedition, I found my first beehive, which I marked on the map. I slept through the night again, and again, my pit was still not finished. I finally had enough of this hellish pit. I dug up the pit and decided to reassemble it. And there it was, the culprit of this entire conundrum. A missing block on the side of the pit courtesy of a small skeleton. I wasn't sure if there was a bug or a feature. I double checked all the sides to make sure there was no sneaky gaps anywhere and ignited the pit once again. I left the pit to burn and ran out to craft a skep. Then I collected a bunch of flowers from the open meadow nearby. It was time to visit the beehive. I slammed down the skep and planted the flowers I collected. I left the skep to be populated by bees and took off. I would not be back for a while. In good news, food was plentiful and I could afford to sprint non-stop. It started to rain, but I had no plans of making a roof just yet. After all, I had big plans for a complete rebuild. I slept through another night to speed up the charcoal process, but it was still burning. I prayed to temporal gods to not let the charcoal debacle happen again. The gods heard me, and after returning to base from a foraging expedition, I saw the pit was finally done. I dug it up immediately. Of course, the bloomeries were pre-crafted and ready to roll. I was insanely excited to officially enter the Iron Age. So far, I managed to get around with just 2 reed baskets and a big clay container. To say that my inventory was limiting would be an understatement. It was time to make some chests. Before I could do that, I got interrupted by my very first temporal storm. I was way too scared and naked to really do anything with it. So, I hid inside of a 2-block hole and waited. Once it passed, I dug myself out. In retrospect, it is not the safest method. Nasty drifters could be waiting for you on the surface as soon as you emerge. In good news, my iron was cooked and ready to be processed. So I set to smith my first ingot, which I immediately converted into a saw. Saw enabled me to craft a ton of planks, and combined with the copper nails, I crafted 8 chests. I took some time to rearrange and sort my inventory. All the extra space felt so good. Then, I made a tiny cellar for a single clay container and slapped a trapdoor on it. Supposedly that works, but I didn't actually test it. It was time to kit out my character with some iron swag. This of course required smithing of iron ingots. With my first ingot, I made a class exclusive blackguard sword. Next, I made an iron hammer. If my bronze hammer broke down and I didn't have a replacement, I could be potentially stuck at square one. Of course, I needed a steel knife. I used said knife to harvest some carrots. Even with half yield due to heat stress, I managed to get 3 stacks. Carrots weren't going to sustain me exclusively though, so I went out hunting. 3-shotting the rams with my new shiny sword felt pretty good. At night, I continued to work on the iron tools, but it was not a great night to do so. The increased rift activity was exposing my dwelling as generally unsafe. Next, I made an axe. Then, I made a chisel followed by an iron pickaxe. I even made an iron hoe. It was time to make a lantern as well, so I smithed a couple of iron plates. Unfortunately, I did not have any clear quartz, so I went out to get some. On the way, I saw a few rams and decided to seize the opportunity to snag them. No problem when they don't hit you, big problem when they do. Sure would be nice to have some armor. Unfortunately, I would not have any armor for a long time yet. The mountain nearby had all the quartz I would ever need, so I collected a bunch and returned to my base. And there it was, a lantern. They're bright, they're permanent, and they don't go out in water. Some voodoo magic indeed, but who's complaining? My iron arsenal was missing a couple of items, mainly a scythe. This was the first time I got to use one and oh my, was it nice. I shuddered thinking about how I used the knife exclusively to cut grass in my review video. And I would need all this grass to fire large amounts of fire clay bricks. I needed these bricks to craft bloomeries for the massive amount of iron processing about to take place. I surrounded my operation with a double layer of packed dirt to prevent any fire hazard. And before you know it, the bricks were cooking away. My first batch of iron was long gone, so it was time to fire up some more bloomeries. A cool feature of my area were all the redwood trees. One tree would provide me with a massive influx of wood, on top of being a pleasant red hue when you made the boards. Meanwhile, it was time to start working on my first batch of leather. So, I made some barrels. Kinda wish they reflected the color of the boards they were made of. Regardless, I filled up the barrels with water. Then, I added powdered limestone to one of them. The other 2 barrels received oak logs and sealed to produce weak tannin. Unfortunately, I did not have enough leather for a full batch, so I decided to go hunting, but not before collecting some cattails and horsetails to make salves. Perhaps chasing prey blindly was not a good idea. I was staring down a gigantic hole with no bottom inside. I had to remind myself of the hardcore nature of this playthrough. The rest of the hunt went pretty uneventful. I returned with a lot of meat and enough leather to start my first batch. My fire bricks got done cooking, which meant more bloomeries full of delicious iron. What was I going to do with all that iron? Well, I decided to do what I promised myself not to do in my original playthrough. Rush steel. However, one of my goals was a full set of steel plate, so I suppose steel was unavoidable. Luckily, while running south to my new home, I ran through a bauxite mountain. I set off north to get some bauxite rock, way before I was anywhere near a pulverizer. It was a bit of a run, but I found some resin on the way, and there was no shortage of bauxite at the destination. On the way home, I found a treasure hunter, the only NPC I actually cared for. My other goal was to do Resonance Archive dungeon, so I needed a treasure hunter to get a map of the location. I was prepared to search for hours for an NPC, but there he was. At home, I stashed my bauxite and watered my flax. Flax was sure slow to grow. I proceeded to smith even more copper nails. I wanted more chests for storage as I was already running out of space. Storage is king, baby. I smithed a couple more things I was missing, like a prospecting pick. I was fully decked out now. However, I ran out of brown coal in the process. Earlier, I have seen some more brown coal west of my base. While it was not going to substitute charcoal for bloomeries or steel making, it would save me a ton of charcoal and everything else. Luckily, I found some surface coal almost right away. I dug underneath and loaded up on a couple of stacks of brown coal. By the time I returned, my leather was done cooking in the limestone mixture, so I transferred it into a barrel of weak tannin and started soaking more oak logs to make sure strong tannin was ready to go. However, one batch of leather was not going to cut it, so I used a quern to grind some more limestone, dissolved it in the leftmost barrel, and went out hunting for more leather. These hunts seemed to generate a lot of close calls. While taking on an ewe, an angry ram came out of nowhere to defend his flock and almost cost me this video. I barely managed to escape and heal, but the local drifters were not going to let me rest. I had enough leather now, so I ran back to the base. Regardless, staying out at night with a quarter of health was not a good idea. My next project was going to be a windmill, so I started trying to figure out the dimensions. I could easily craft cobblestone from all the mining I have done, so that was my primary building material. Once I had the dimensions figured out, I started building up. Normally, I like to design things in creative, but not this time. I was going to wing it. The windmill foundation looked pretty cool. One problem though, working at those heights was a little unsafe. So I ran out to get more horsetails to craft salves, which would keep me topped off. If only you could cultivate horsetails like you can cattails. Meanwhile, some of my flax was maturing, which was timely. I needed cloth for windsails. Unfortunately, I still only had enough for a single set. I crafted a rotor and slapped a set of sails on it. At this point, I realized that I needed to drastically expand my flax operation. So I went back to the medium fertility strip I made in the middle of a lake and started fencing it off. Did I mention I enjoyed the redwood color quite a bit? Once I had everything fenced in, I started to till the soil. Finally, I had self-irrigating, wildlife protected, and an entirely huge plot of farmland. I saw a lot of cloth in my future. Then, I planted all the flax seeds that I had at the time, but that was just the start. I also threw some bonus cabbage on the plot. Meanwhile, I started to craft pulverizer parts, which of course involved making a few iron caps and plate to make a toggle. Then, I made an absolute crater by gathering all of the fire clay I could get my hands on. I needed a ton of refractory bricks. Then, it was time to put my batch of leather inside of a strong tannin barrel. In about 4.5 days, I would have my first leather bag. While my pulverizer was not ready to be unveiled, automating quern provided me relief from having to grind limestone by hand. Meanwhile, I knew that the pulverizer needed to be automated to be of any use. So I began pouring copper ingots and smithing them into copper plates to eventually make hoppers. While these ingots were cooling, I decided to sacrifice some bauxite to make cobblestone to spice up the look of the windmill. After testing a couple of designs and adding an extra set of sails, I finally settled on a look. My entire smithing setup was going to be placed inside of the windmill, so I wanted to make it cozy by placing windows to the outside. Meanwhile, I started cooking ground lime in the fire to make mortar. Of course, it was also time to start smithing copper plates to make hoppers. Furthermore, I needed copper chutes for the automation as well. Finally had all the necessary pieces to make a fully self-sufficient pulverizer setup. Now, all that was left to do is to load up bauxite rock. While the pulverizer was doing its thing, I crafted a couple of more barrels to make mortar, but realized I had no sand. I did not have any immediate sand around my base, so I made a decently long trek to some claystone dunes. After returning home, I had all the ingredients for mortar: water, quicklime, and claystone sand. I made a couple of stacks, which would last me a while. Next on the list was crushed quartz. On the way to the quartz mountain, I found some surface quartz, which saved me a trip. Now, all that was left to do is to mine. Then, come back home and load up the pulverizer, which was already done with the bauxite. Meanwhile, my first batch of leather was finally done. It was enough to craft 3 leather backpacks, which are the best ones in the game. The extra inventory space was freaking nice. What wasn't nice? Having to make another charcoal pit. Steel process would quickly consume my supplies, so I returned to the beautiful redwoods. I felt a little guilty cutting them, but not guilty enough. They made charcoal process so much faster. Before long, my charcoal pit was entirely filled and ignited. I prayed to the temporal gods just in case. Once the charcoal pit was smoldering, I was ready to craft refractory bricks. I had plenty of fire clay, crushed bauxite, and crushed quartz to make a big batch, which meant I had a lot of stuff to fire. Which meant stopping by to get peat, cutting down a ton of grass, and collecting sticks for days. If only I knew about shears at this point. Nonetheless, slowly but surely, I collected enough sticks and lit up all of the fire pits. Together, they could be seen from space, I bet. Of course, there would be no steel without iron, so I used my dirt tunnel to return to the iron mine and continued excavating. This mine kept on giving. Soon, I had 8 bloomeries cooking up a big batch. Unfortunately, that meant I would have a lot of smithing in my future. This forced me to start thinking about a Helve hammer. I did not manage to get one going in my review video, but I would not be smithing all of this iron by hand. Of that, I was sure. I wanted a for sale setup for my Helve hammer, but unfortunately my flax field was nowhere near being done. I removed my pulverizer and plugged in the Helve hammer. It did work, so that was good news. It was time to relocate my smithing setup to the windmill. Before I could finish though, another temporal storm. Back to my hiding cubby. Once the storm was done, I surfaced to a much worse situation than last time. Multiple high-level drifters assaulted me upon surfacing, and my base was swarming with drifters too. With a little bit of bunny hopping, sword swinging, and healing, I cleaned up my base. A big batch of iron got done cooking, but the wind conditions were unfavorable, so it was not a good idea to use the Helve hammer. I was also starting to realize I wanted a much more robust Helve hammer setup. You can run up to 4 Helve hammers on a single anvil. That meant getting a lot more resin and flax, so I set south to find some resin. Fortunately, pines were not hard to come by and resin was abundant. I grabbed any flax I could find as well. Meanwhile, I tried my Helve hammer setup. To say that it was anemic would be an understatement. It would most definitely be faster to smith by hand. To add insult to an injury, my windmill was not a very safe place that night, but my actual base was much worse. I had to spend the rest of the night foraging until the daylight came. Around this time, I felt badly bottlenecked by flax growth speed. I needed a fertilizer to speed up the process, specifically a cave fertilizer, of which there were 2 kinds, potash and saltpeter. Not knowing much about either, I set my sights on potash, which can be found in sylvite ore. One problem though, it only originates inside halite deposits. Halite deposits are rare and only naturally occur in dry lakes, which meant I needed to find a desert. Now, in retrospect, this was a dumb idea. Nonetheless, I set out further south to try to find a desert. Soon, I started seeing acacia trees and hyenas everywhere. I was inside a savanna. The desert wasn't too far ahead. Once in a desert, there was a couple of methods to find halite. Stripping the top layer of sand can sometimes reveal halite underneath. Another method was to prospect, hoping for a halite reading. After doing both methods for a good duration and finding jack shit, I did some more research and realized it was probably a fool's errand. Potash was a pipe dream. Saltpeter, on the other hand, was much more common, but I had to explore some deep caves. Here I was, ready to do my first cave dive of the game. A little scary with no armor, but as they say,
fortune favors the brave.
Surprisingly, the first cave I descended just happened to have saltpeter on the walls. It wasn't a ton, and I grabbed every last bit. I descended a bit deeper to check for more, but I was greeted by a swarm of locusts, which probably meant a locust nest and my sign to get the hell out. When I made it home, I spread saltpeter on every single flax plant. This would expedite the process considerably. My base was not swarming with drifters like when I left, but not free of drifters either. I would have loved a safer living arrangement, but I had bigger fish to fry. Mainly, I decided to make another farming expansion as my main one was running out of space. Meanwhile, I decided to address my half-finished windmill and completed the build. Next, I decided to check on the charcoal pit and saw that it was finished, thank temporal god. What wasn't finished is any of my flax. So in the interim, I fired a bunch of quarry clay bricks for more bloomeries. There would never be a lack of demand for those. I decided to knock out a refractory furnace next. Had all the necessary materials to make refractory blocks and proceeded to build the furnace mostly from memory. I still lacked iron doors, but those would have to wait. Besides building the furnace, there was also micro chiseling involved to make sure coal stayed contained underneath. The furnace would not be ready to go for a while, but I preemptively loaded up with charcoal anyway. Of course, running a single furnace would be too slow for my needs, so I started to build another one. Unfortunately, I did my math wrong and ran out of refractory blocks. Begrudgingly, I reassembled my pulverizer and started grinding. Once it was done, I fired up another batch of refractory bricks. With not much else to do, I returned to my iron mine, which was starting to look a lot emptier and sparser. With the mining run behind me, I cooked up even more iron. It felt like a never-ending cycle. Next, it was about time to start thinking about something nicer to live in. I wanted to use a lot of polished rock, but quickly realized that polished rock is prohibitively hard to get in large quantities. Rock Quarry mod to the rescue. It requires smithing of some brand new tools. One of those tools was an iron plug, and I needed loads. I spent a good portion of my sanity hammering out 12 ingots that later I turned into 12 plugs. I took the plugs to where the basalt rock was permeating the strata. The process was somewhat simple. I placed 6 plugs on the bottom of a 6x6x6 square, then I placed another 6 on top. Finally, I hammered them in and got a big rock slab. I took a few of these slabs back to my base and smithed a finishing chisel. Now, all I had to do was place the slab down, equip a hammer in your offhand, and using a finishing chisel, shear polished basalt off the slab. With polished basalt at hand, I started to figure out a design for my house. It would not be complete for a long time still, but at least the project was started. Meanwhile, a good bit of my flax finally matured to fruition. So I proceeded to craft all the components for another Helve hammer and another windmill. The internals of my windmill needed a redesign on the inside, with Helve hammers pointing towards the central point. I slapped an end mill in the middle, and my double hammer setup was online. It was nice, but it was just a start. When the night set in, my dwelling was a complete shit show, and all I could do was to retreat inside of the windmill. The night provided me with a strong wind. It was a good time to test out my Helve hammer setup. After all, I needed an absolute boatload of ingots and plates. The setup wasn't terribly fast, and I could have doubled the output if I contributed, but I just wanted to Netflix and chill. The night proved to be extremely productive, but at first daylight, the wind completely stopped. That's the real downside on windmills, relying on the fickle wind patterns. I exited the windmill and proceeded to collect the refractory bricks which were done cooking. I crafted them into blocks and used a couple to finish off the second furnace. The rest would be reserved for furnace repair down the line. Another night came and I was back inside of the windmill. The Helve hammers were significantly slower that night and came to a full stop soon after. On the way out of the windmill, I ran into a couple of drifters. They were really becoming a nuisance all of a sudden. Perhaps just bad rift spawn RNG. Despite a bad wind night, I managed to smith enough place to make an iron door for the furnace. Next night came with little to no wind as well, but I needed to hammer out an iron anvil by hand anyway. I smithed the bottom, I smithed the top, I used borax to glue 2 pieces together, then just a little hammer action and 1 iron anvil was served. A pretty big achievement. Meanwhile, the wind picked up and I used the opportunity to produce more ingots and plates. After all, I still needed a second iron door and a whopping 32 ingot run to stuff the steel furnaces. While my iron production was hitting all-time highs, my base continued to be a complete disaster. I decided to grit my teeth and persevere towards starting the steel process. Luckily, I had everything I needed now. Well, everything but the stone coffin lid, which forced me to make a detour to get more borax. Of course, I already had a spot in mind, so that was easy. Then, I stopped to carve out some whole granite blocks. After a monumental effort, both furnaces were lit and cooking. I felt pretty accomplished. Unfortunately, I burned all of the brown coal in the process and was not about to switch to charcoal for my smithing needs. Charcoal was reserved for running the refractory furnaces. Fortunately, there was no shortage of brown coal around my area. Speaking of charcoal, there was never enough of it either. To fix that, I cut down a bunch of redwoods, created another charcoal pit, and filled it up to the brim. By the time I was finished with the charcoal pit, it was time to experience the riveting gameplay of another temporal storm. This time around, the exit was much cleaner. Despite the storm passing by, my night was extremely rough and full of drifters. Only when the sun came out was I able to restart my furnace for round 2. It was starting to look like fall. Luckily, I didn't expect the fall to make a significant difference in my experience in the south. Next, I went back to my iron mine. I still needed at least 2 more batches of steel if I wanted to make full plate. The iron mine was starting to look like slim pickings. I prayed that my iron mine would last me through the end of the playthrough. I did not want to look for a new source. Suddenly, I remembered about the beehive I found months ago and decided it was a good time to get some bees. At my base, I made a little fenced area with a bunch of flowers and 4 additional empty skeps to expand my bee operation. While tending to the bees, yet another batch of charcoal matured. Meanwhile, I remembered my half-abandoned mega house project. Among many things, it needed some glass windows. So I went out to get a lot of quartz and started cooking it up in the bloomeries. Now that the majority of iron was done cooking, I could switch to making glass. I would need an absolute ton of it. One large task still loomed over me. Another round of 32 iron ingots needed to be made. I wanted to maximize the speed at which I could produce these ingots, but I needed way more resin for that. Luckily, all I had to do is follow my previous resin markers to load up. I wanted to highlight a cool resin spot. Look at this, 4 leaking pines next to each other. Nice. The following night was super windy, so I set my plan into motion. I was going to add an extra Helve hammer to my setup. I only had 2 sets of wind sails, but it was enough to power an extra hammer. Unfortunately, by the time I was done setting up, the wind seemed to slow down dramatically. But I had a proof of concept. It worked. My drifter misfortunes continued. This time around they chose to hang out in my charcoal pit. Meanwhile, to keep my house from being vaporware, I extended the main shape and put in a couple windows. I decided against making my build monocolor and deleted the second half of the floor. I wanted to explore black and red theme, so I ran to the north while almost dying to a pack of wolves. Once I hit the bauxite shelf, I quarried a bunch of it out. When running back home, it got incredibly windy, and when I arrived, it was gale outside. I felt obligated to hit up my windmill to produce more ingots. It was an incredibly productive session, and by the end, I had 32 ingots ready to go. It was timely, because my first batch of steel was finally done cooking. Unfortunately, quite a few blocks got damaged in the process, but I had replacement blocks ready to go. I replaced all the damaged blocks, loaded up another batch of iron, made sure the furnaces were full of charcoal, and fired them up. Second batch was off to the races. To sustain myself through all the hard work, I was harvesting berries from my berry bushes. Fortunately, I was pretty sure they were going to be producing through the winter down here in the south. It was another good wind day, and I went up to the windmill to make some iron chain. This is where I must admit to installing another mod called Helve Hammer Extensions. It allows Helve hammers to produce every item, unlike their regular state which only makes ingots and plates. I was not going to hammer out 20 pieces of iron chain and another 16 plates by hand. Meanwhile, I needed another batch of leather to produce leather jerkin needed for the armor. Next, I returned to my iron mine one more time, but this clearly would be the last. Besides swarming with drifters, it was also now devoid of any iron. This mine went the distance. I was just hoping that it would be enough for the rest of the game. Following my visit to the mine, I started yet another batch of charcoal and gathered some more mature flax. In a surprise to no one, being at my base continued to be an unsafe endeavor. It was time to address that, so I started pouring copper ingots en masse. My plan was to make lanterns, which would alleviate some of the darkness and hopefully suppress some of their spawns. With the extra flax, I was finally able to move to a penultimate 4-Helve hammer setup. I couldn't test it though, wind sucked, and instead I went out to start working on a greenhouse. It was getting colder, and without knowing how cold it would actually get, I thought a greenhouse would be a nice insurance policy. Next, I got around to harvesting my beehives and replacing them with empty ones. Then, I squeezed the honey into some bowls and crafted candles with wax. The final destination were lanterns. I made 4 and placed them around my base, hoping to see the difference in drifter spawns. It would not be enough, but it was a start. My nights were brighter, but also windier. I took immediate advantage of this fact with my now awesome setup. What a difference. Consequently, I didn't hate smithing now because, well, I didn't have to do it. After hammering out another 32 ingots for the batch, I returned to finish my greenhouse. I then planted cabbages and carrots inside. Spoiler alert, I didn't really need the greenhouse. Charcoal pit was done, so I gathered the coal and then I planted a lot of flax. I didn't necessarily know what I was going to use it for, but figured it wouldn't hurt. I crafted a couple more lanterns and placed them around my base. It was starting to feel a bit safer. Finally, I got around to working on my crib. I figured out the general shape, placed all the floor blocks, and figured out the back shape. I then filled in the walls, while leaving empty space for the windows. Meanwhile, I started to remove the original rune, but it was not a good night to do that. I was getting overwhelmed by drifters. So I retreated into my windmill, but even that didn't feel safe. I was forced to escape with my tail between my legs and barely alive. I needed healing bad, so I beelined into the nearest horsetails, and by the time I collected some, the day came, and I was able to stop by my place to grab some more cattails and heal. I did not want to make a habit of dropping this low. I returned to the original task of disassembling the rune. I was planning to move into my new place for good. Next, I made a staircase going up and made it look fancy. After filling it with more cobblestone and accenting it with basalt, I like what I saw. Meanwhile, my second batch of steel was finally done. I immediately jumped into repairing the structure, loading it up with some more iron, stuffing the bottom furnace with charcoal, and starting it back up. This would probably be my last batch. The wind was blowing hard, so I immediately jumped into making steel ingots and finishing off the steel chain. I also made some more nails for the chests, since my storage was maxing out. I finished crafting all the 20 pieces of steel chain and was able to transition into plates. Once that was done, I crafted some chests and started methodically moving every chest and every piece of hardware from the bottom to my new crib. By the time it was done, only a lonely barrel was left. I still had leather in it, so I would have to wait. I spent a bit of time making cobblestone paths before being rudely interrupted by a temporal storm. Once it passed, I almost got one-shot by a high-level drifter trying to escape the hole. Yikes. To add insult to an injury, my temporal wall proved to be a little porous as drifters were able to climb the walls. I had to remove some blocks to stop it from happening. Meanwhile, last batch of leather was done, and that meant I could finally craft a full set of steel chain armor. It looked dope, and knowing what I know now, I should have stopped right there and then. Plate armor had quite a few downsides I wasn't aware of, while chain had way less. It made me a little bit slower and reduced the healing rate, but it was all manageable. Finally, I didn't have to do a full sprint from every wolf. Regardless, I was very close to upgrading my chain into plate and doing Resonance Archives dungeon. So it was time to visit the treasure hunter NPC to get the location. He was willing to part with the map, but only if I gave him a tin bronze pickaxe. Luckily, I had some loose tin to make one. Meanwhile, I was getting sick of random drifter hordes. Even with the lanterns everywhere, it didn't seem to matter. I was enjoying my new living arrangement though, and kept making additions. I built a little cellar and placed my clay container there along with a few shelves. I was planning to fill these shelves with crocks full of food. Outside, it was still complete chaos. It sure would be nice to have a rift ward to stop this nonsense. It was something I was definitely interested in pursuing after the archives. Next, I wanted to preserve a lot of food, so I made a crock and filled it with meat stew. Then, I sealed it with wax. This increased the shelf life to more than a year and a half. Very nice. I also started yet another charcoal pit. I was hoping it would be my last. Following, I returned to the treasure hunter with a tin bronze pickaxe, and he gave me a map in exchange. This marked Resonance Archives on my mini-map. It looked far, very far. That would be one hell of a journey. I prepped by hunting, cooking, and storing my food in sealed crocks. I figured I would need all of this food for the archives. Besides food, I was aiming to make honey sulfur bandages, the most powerful healing bandage in the game. It requires sulfur as the name implies, but that was something I already found. When I returned home, my charcoal pit was done, so I fired up 9 bloomeries worth of quartz. I needed a lot of glass to finish my base. Back to poultices. Another ingredient was honey, which I had in spades. Finally, it required cloth, but flax was something I had been on top of the entire game. I ground some sulfur in a quern, grabbed the other ingredients, and just like that I crafted 4 stacks of bandages. Not much else was left to do besides waiting for more steel, so I spent the hours finishing my house. My first batch of glass was done, so I put in some windows. I ran out of glass way before I could finish though. Next, I had to fire more clay bricks. I would need a lot more glass, and thus bloomeries. I stood still for a second and admired my base. It was starting to look pretty cool. No time to waste though. I fired up the clay pits and ran to the mountain for even more quartz. When I returned, yet another batch of glass was ready to go. It didn't last very long at all, and I was out. Instead, I worked on building support structures underneath, so it didn't look like my base was floating in the air. Of course, I fired up another set of bloomeries with quartz. My final batch of steel was done, but the wind speed sucked, so I worked on my base a little more. I was generally happy with how it looked. At night, I retreated back to the windmill and finished hammering out the ingots and plates, which meant I had enough to finally finish full plate armor. And there it was. My original goal of making full plate armor was complete. It looked absolutely badass. Besides the plate armor, I crafted myself the best steel weapon, a steel shield, and every type of steel tool on the menu. I was officially pimped out. However, before I was ready to leave for my long journey, I wanted to do just a little more work on my base. I started putting in the front glass wall. You get the idea. Of course, I didn't have nearly enough glass to finish, so I fired a few more bloomeries and started the archive prep. I tried to figure out if I could tailor clothes, but it wasn't clear. Instead, I found you could repair clothes for the price of 2 linen. I was heading north into extremely cold weather, so I figured it was worthwhile investment to repair whatever I already had. I loaded up my inventory with food, dirt blocks, healing salves, and many other goodies. I had no idea what I was getting into, so I went in overprepared. Unfortunately, I had to de-equip the plate armor, otherwise the run would have taken 3 times as long. I would be extremely vulnerable until I would reach my destination. With that in mind, I gave my base a look over and said my goodbyes. Then I set northeast towards the archives. I was hard sprinting during the day, I was hard sprinting during the night. Soon I was in the midst of deep winter and had to stop to warm myself. Of course, I would equip my armor while standing in front of the campfire trying to warm up. Eventually I reached a mountain and started towering straight up. Shortly I ended up at the glacier. Who knew they had glaciers in this game? And there it was, the entrance to the archives. I immediately grabbed the cool looking rusted doors. That would be the last thing I managed to grab though. Unfortunately, you could not break any blocks in the archives to take back home as mementos. When I was fully warmed up in front of a campfire, I went in. I descended a long shaft into the scary and unknown dungeon. It spit me out on a flimsy looking circular platform with a ton of high level enemies. There were no match for my gear. My first door was a library, but it was locked, so I went down a long set of stairs instead. The first unlocked room that I encountered happened to be engineering. I went inside and found a furnace that could stuff with coal and light. This reactivated the ancient machinery and the room came to life along with all the lights. There were various treasure chests inside, but I did not need most of the stuff. I did grab a few paintings and some other bling that I immediately equipped on my character. Next, I found a guardhouse, but it was extremely unremarkable. I went into the commons and was greeted with a horde of locusts and drifters. Inside one of the rooms, I found a saw-blade locust, but it posed no threat at all. I seemingly ran out of rooms on the second floor and went back to the first floor. Here, I went into a guard room, which once again didn't seem to have anything of interest. Next room was called a bell workshop. I kind of knew what that meant. Bells are one of the rarest and toughest enemies in Vintage Story, and sure enough, there was my first bell encounter. It tends to summon a lot of help, but once again it was easy. Perhaps I was a little overgeared for this. Inside the shop, I found a rare flux part, which was part of the Rift Ward assembly. This was a nice first step towards building a Rift Ward. I also found a gold necklace and a funky looking green gear, clearly a quest item. After wandering aimlessly for a while, I figured the gear was part of the engineering machine. More aimless wandering followed, until I found a translocator room with a working teleporter, which I immediately took. Here, I encountered the most opposition, including drifters and locusts. Furthermore, I learned an important lesson. Plate armor reduced healing rate down to 0, which meant I had to completely remove my armor to heal. Fun. Good thing I took time to do just that though, because next I ran into a pretty intense fight that chunked me decently hard. Finally, I found my target, an ancient pump with a detachable piece that I could grab. If you guessed it had to go back to engineering, you are right. After installing all the parts, something told me that the library was now open, and sure as shit, I went in and saw an ominous looking hole that the game invited me to jump into. I expected the worst. And of course, there was a boss down here. I didn't really have any strategy, so I just got into his face and hit him, and hit him, and hit him some more. Occasionally he would pound the ground and rocks came crashing down on me, dealing massive damage. Eventually I was hurt enough to make a risky play. I ran behind a pillar, equipped my armor to heal, and got hit by a cave-in and almost died. Despite that, I managed to heal and put my armor back. Then a little more of the get in his face and swing wildly tactics, and I got her done. Behind the boss, I found a furnace that could supposedly light. But I doused my torch swimming in the sewers and had to proceed without that. Supposedly, it turns the lights on in the library. Well, a lantern would have to do. This was what all the fuss was all about. The library. Inside the library, there was some lore thingy, but I'm not a lore guy. There were also lore books on the shelves as well. Ew. The only cool thing I found for myself was a schematic to a glider. Cool. There didn't seem to be anything else of interest here for me, so I climbed back to the entrance through the long shaft. Then, took off my armor and started running back. Not a particularly exciting affair. This time around, I was sprinting as well, but ignoring the cold completely. I was using my salves to heal through the cold damage instead. Getting back was pretty drama-free. In the end, I didn't even need a quarter of the supplies that I brought. Once home, I made an armor stand and decorated the base with some of the spoils. Hail Oscilloscape, the conqueror of Resonance Archives. It was time to get back to finishing my house, which meant more quartz and more bloomeries. A temporal storm hit, but I was not going to hide in fear this time around. I equipped my plate and showed all the horrors who was the main character now. After, I fired more fire bricks. Looking over my base, it was coming together. One of my final goals was to build a Rift Ward. I looted the most important part in the archives, but I still needed 2 Jonas parts. Unfortunately, they only dropped from Sawblade Locusts and Locust Nests, which meant I need to go on the cave diving rampage trying to locate them. What I quickly learned though, Sawblade Locusts were extremely rare, and Locust Nests were even rarer. I did find my first bit of lava in-game. I didn't even know Vintage Story had lava. I also learned, even when you managed to find some nests and Sawblade Locusts, they were not guaranteed to drop a Jonas part. What made this ordeal even worse, there are 13 different types of Jonas parts, and I needed 2. This quickly proved to be so RNG heavy that it was not worth the pursuit. I dove into dozens of underground dungeons and barely found any targets capable of dropping parts. They were so rare in fact, that I made a trek into the same dungeon I visited in the desert because at least I knew there was a nest there. Furthermore, cave diving was not ultra safe either, even in plate armor. Tier 4 drifters were not that uncommon, and boy did they pack a punch. In fact, I came very close to dying in one of the dungeons. After spending countless hours cave diving, all I had to show for it were 2 identical Jonas parts, and neither of them were for Rift Ward recipe. The writing was on the wall. Rift Ward was not going to happen. I did find a lot of old furniture and paintings. Well, I had no excuse not to finish the house now. So I made another batch of glass and finished off the roof. My crib was finally complete. To pass the remaining time, I tried some of the things I never attempted in Vintage Story. I made an oven and learned how to bake pies and bread. I did an aesthetic redesign in the windmill to make it a bit cooler from the side angle. I made a little pillar where I would have put my riftward.
If I had one!
I tested my glider during the temporal storm and almost killed myself during the landing. Glider was not as good as Elytra with rockets, that's for sure. I built another greenhouse simply for aesthetic reasons. I put up more lanterns around for extra light. I made a fruit press and made some juice, which I put into a barrel and sealed. Unfortunately, the alcohol would not be ready in time. I put up some extra fencing, I made a tool rack. I discovered a bug that lets you fly the glider without having it equipped. I found a trapped bear and a wolf in the same pit and tested my armor against them, before taking my petty revenge for all the suffering they caused me in this playthrough. I tried luring some wildlife with a feeding trough, before deciding it was hilariously hard. Vintage Story really needs a better system for escorting animals. But mainly, I just slept in my newly crafted bed to pass as much time as possible. And there it was, April 2nd, the 100-day mark. I did it, boys, not going to lie, it was a doozy. This was by far the longest script I ever wrote and the longest video I ever made. 100 days in Vintage Story is a very long time, and I did it all in hardcore. I learned a lot about the game through this adventure and hit all of my original goals. I survived, I had a full set of plate armor, I raided the Resonance archives, and built a dope base. However, I did hit my saturation point by the end, and now I needed a long break from Vintage Story. If you're still here, seriously, I am impressed. And more importantly, I love you. Don't forget to do all that YouTube stuff. I have plenty of other video ideas, but not right this second. Your boy needs to rest, so for now, A Still Escape is beaming out.